maybe you could start this, if you're willing, just to ask you where you're up to in your own journey with sexual energy, how you're teaching it maybe, or anything you want to share about that. How does that sound?
Yeah, we can start like that. I just wanted to add that I really appreciate you as a friend and as a colleague over the years that we've known each other. And when we do get to speak, because we seem to arrive at the same kind of conclusions, sometimes directly through very similar experiences, and other times through very, not maybe vastly different experiences, but we arrive at the same kind of insights or life lessons. So I really appreciate you in that respect. Yeah, how I've been working with sexual energy and men and supporting that. This year, I started 2026 with a men's retreat, which was very soft and gentle. So I think one thing that I'm bringing to supporting men is this, and I think you do as well, is this grounded, um, you could say in terms of like Tao, almost a yin approach to what would be a fiery topic. We know that men's sexual energy tends towards the fire end of polarity and can ignite quite quickly. So I really like to support men to observe their cycle of arousal, they're using porn or not, you know, what's going on for them in their daily life, if they have a partner or whatever they're doing to that feeds into that fieriness, that fiery nature of the men's sexual arousal, sexual energy, and to become aware of how that builds up over time. And so instead of being binary one way or the other of like seminal retention or just unconscious, we could say, following of release, to not judge either of those positions, but to observe how is my sleep, how is my mental focus, how are my energy levels in the morning, and how does my adhering to following the natural cycles of my own testosterone and other hormone production support me to give to myself, to nourish myself with pleasure, with a positive connection to my sexual energy, rather than seeing it as this pesky problem that I need to discharge or ignore. So, yeah, I'd like to start there by saying one of the first things that we can do is just start to observe, like the ancient Taoists did, observing nature, observing the cycles. And we tend to think more women have their menstrual cycles and menopause, but men have this cycle. The refractory period is a name for part of it, but there are deeper and longer cycles with this regenerative aspect. And I like to pose the question, what would it be to give to yourself rather than if horniness and arousal is a problem or a, an itch to scratch? One way to deal with that is to have a release ourselves or with a partner. But what would it mean and what would our life be like if we were inquiring what would giving to my sexual self feel like, look like? And then we're attuning to our physiology and our nature. So I think I'd start there.
That's wonderful. Yeah, the Tao is so simple. The more I've studied it over the years, it just seems about, what do you learn when you pay attention? It doesn't seem to be much more than that. And it's funny, man. I'm in the process of putting my level. I've created this level one training, which I've called Way of Water, and that's really about what you're describing there. What can we learn from our nervous system? But how do we show up to our sexual self? How do we show up to our sexual energy, our arousal? And generally that level one course is just teaching men how to do that. Because I think as men, we've been so hardwired to we have all these words like, oh, she's hot, she has a hot body, spice things up a little. There's a lot of heat words around that. And so I often start my training by letting men feel the cooler end, what I could call, or the more conscious end, the more relaxed end of their sexual energy, and just how to connect with that. And as you say, I often say that in everything, whether it's might be doing yoga, sexual energy, Tai Chi, there's three, well, I'd say it's four gates that has to pass. The first gate I say is first look at your teacher. Don't listen to what they're saying. You know, whatever technique they're promising is going to do this, that, and the other. Look to your teacher first. Or do they represent a kind of beingness, a kind of, you know, whatever you're after in life? Are they embodying that? That's level one, because that's where you're going to go generally if you're following this teacher or this method taught in that way. But so hopefully, if they're on their course, they've already thought, you know, he doesn't have much hair, strange beard, and but we'll train with him anyway, you know. And then the second is how do I feel during the practice? Like just what you're saying, man. It's like, and you know, that's a journey in itself. Because at first we might be like, I feel amazing, you know, looking at these images and like, oh, it feels so empowering and fiery and so that seems like, oh yeah, I feel good during the training or during the practice. But then the next question, you know, you just posed as well is, how do I feel directly after the practice? And sometimes even, you know, I speak to men who choose for ejaculation and, you know, I still choose to conscious ejaculation. So sometimes if it's a natural phenomenon, I'm not retaining or pushing against anything. But how do you feel afterwards? You know, and some guys will say, "Oh yeah, I still felt pretty good. I felt on fire. I felt, you know."
Mm,
Okay, the third question, how do you feel the next day? Then the
mm,
fourth question, the next week, how you felt? Oh, afterwards, my heart was shut down. I felt more the need to chase again. This with that, you know, so I'm on this kind of roller coaster.
mm,
And so I think those are the three brilliant gates to pass through. You know, how do I feel now within, make, let's call it self-pleasure practice? How do I feel directly afterwards? How do I feel for the rest of the week? Now, if all those things have got a little tick box, I think we're heading in the right direction. And then it's, I guess, what you're saying as well, Julian, is like, my body is my teacher. My
mm,
own experience is my teacher. You know, that's it's all there. And so I love this idea of, you know, that's why I often say in the level one training with the men, just learn to slow down first. You're so used to
mm,
friction and quickness. And
mm,
I've been sitting with this. It'd be interesting your thoughts on this. So I encourage the men to meet where their sexual energy where it is. And
mm,
so it's tough for a man to say, okay, I'm just going to slow down and be very mindful. I'm not going to look at any erotic images anymore. And they just can't connect with their arousal. So it just doesn't work. So you know, I say to men, you know, meet your energy where it is. But also I realizing there's a big part in the programming of my training to reprogram the nervous system. And I find myself more than I used to inviting men not to use erotic imageries, not because they're bad or anything like that. There's no guilt or shame or dogma attached to that. But what I really encourage them to follow is to create a new route to arousal. So instead of
mm,
the optic nerve or fantasy using images, like, can you reach your arousal in a way you're totally self-sufficient? This is all about your relationship with your body through massage, through oil, and then and that can be so liberating. Where I have so many men on the first week of the train, it's like, oh my God, I'm just self-pleasured for the first time in my life without using fantasy or imagery. And so yeah, so that it'd be interesting to know where you're up to on your journey or that, or any reflections on that so far.
Oh, thank you, Graham. Yeah, absolutely mirroring, which I spoke to at the beginning of our chat today, of how we reached the same conclusions with different language. Sometimes when I meet with you, it's literally that we describe the same thing with different words. So I would say two things that you spoke to there. One about the coolness or the so both of us have shared some teachings, received some teachings from Mantak Chia, haven't we?
Yeah.
Directly or indirectly. And some of his senior Western teachers were my teachers. And awakening unaroused sexual energy, I believe, is how they term it in that lineage, is about becoming aware of the aliveness at the pelvic bowl, at the perineum, between the genitals or in the genitals. And as I guide people with breath, movement, sound, and touch, as you probably do similarly, I've heard some of what you share on these programs. I find that the men can become aware of this kind of mentally, often it's reported as a type of menthol, minty kind of cool freshness, like you've brushed your teeth and then you take a breath. They can feel that kind of, and that's what I feel too, down at the perineum, um, down there. And then if we bring arousal in, that kind of cool vitality heats up when we're young, usually when we're young men in our 20s or teens, that horniness can feel like honey or treacle or maple syrup running through your veins in the intensity of that fiery, sugary heat. So yeah, I think it's nice to add a few words to the experience. And then I do the same, Graham, in terms of like I feel it's good advice to find a teacher that you align with how they are in their being. I would say then that's a being-based approach rather than not looking at the teacher and how you feel in their presence and how they seem to carry their energy, but just go because they say they have this list of techniques, which would be like a cerebral attraction to attaining certain things. But actually, how is it living in them? How is that supporting them as a human being? And then we can feel our inner calling, like Rumi said, what we're um, calling is calling us. What we're calling in is calling us. It's a different quote. But yeah, to pattern interrupt something because there's an inner calling to have a different experience. And whoever we seek to support us in that is the embodiment of should be, ideally, the embodiment of what we are also wanting to grow in ourselves. It's not perhaps that we don't have it, it's that we need to grow and foster it and water the grass on our side. So yeah, I encourage men to yeah, again, not with shame, like judging imagery or erotica as bad, but how would it be to have a direct experience with your own body? And a few years ago, I was like, how could I describe embodiment in as fewer words as possible?
Mhm.
And I bought this domain name, feelandfollow.com. At the moment, there's no website there. But first, what are the obstacles to me feeling? If I'm used to, by habit, watching erotica to get excited, to stimulate fantasy and the associations in the brain and all that juicy and beautiful meaning making of our desire, that's okay. But is it the only go-to that we have to feel alive and start to move into arousal? So I will, again, without shaming, invite people to experiment with perhaps just watching a couple of minutes and reducing the amount of time that they use that and to find another way to, so I would say we can either kind of wean ourselves off, not because it's bad or wrong, but because we want to have a different experience, or try for a while. I guide men to connect directly to their body and to their sensation. And there's a practice from the Wheel of Consent called waking up the hands, which helps us reconnect. You can just take any household object and it becomes the meditation and the focus for 3 to 5, 20 minutes if you need to start to get curious in the skin, which is to me, how do we remove that lack of use, lack of exercising the muscles of directly tapping into our pleasure and our presence, our ability to drink in sensation. So if we do that with the hands and then bring that to our body, as you say, with oil, have a beautiful ritual of now I'm going to set aside some time for me to enjoy being fully in my body. So I guide men like that, either to play with using erotica in the beginning and then putting it aside and having a very embodied experience. And the more that grows, the less they need to rely upon the other. Or if they're like, no, I want to explore this new feel and follow way of touching and being with myself, then I'll say set it aside and support them in how to wake up their sense and their direct route to pleasure through their own hands, their own body, and their own energy system, and let
Mm.
that be the guide. And I could briefly tell you kind of shall I give a simple example of that?
Sure.
So, yeah, a few years ago, I got a male client who was coming for somatic sexology and sex coaching. And he said, can we have a practical led guided session on how to do what I've just said? So I reflected on it and he really wanted to be guided through. So in my Lisbon practice, I invited him to book a session, and I thought, what are the most simple elements of this that if someone was completely new to this practice but really enthusiastic to try, what would I give them? So we set some intentions. There was this beautiful session space with a massive Buddha, and it was very beautiful. So he wanted to include some desire and some consciousness of his partner and her desire to support him in this process. So he wrote some stuff, put it on the altar, and then we moved into the practice, which was very simple in these stages. So I supported him into a deep squat to like bring the energy and the blood flow down to the pelvic bowl, and deep abdominal breathing into the backs of the thighs because the knees are up towards the chest. And then simply going onto a zafu, onto a meditation cushion after a few minutes of building this pressure. Some men go into engorgement and erection from being in a deep squat. Other times it just kind of packs the chi, the life force energy into the pelvic floor and the genitals, and the genitals become like denser and more full of blood and chi. And that pressure can then relieve as you sit down after a few minutes onto a zafu and the hips open. There can be this, so it's bringing the attention to the flushing of this blood flow that's now freed from this pressured stance of deep squat. And this can already be blissful. So, guiding the client or ourselves into our self awareness, what do I feel when I sit down and let this blood flow just do its natural thing of dissipating from the pelvis and down into the legs? So, there's a subtle internal noticing there. And then the invitation was to wake up the lingam with pressure down the midline, simple like Taoist reflexology down the penis. And he was like, wow, this is the first time I've ever woken myself up in such a slow, conscious, and gentle way. And I asked, what are you noticing? And he like, uh, a fire, a gentle warmth from the pelvic bowl and the belly, the hara or lower dantian. And it was like he could feel solar flares almost like reaching up into his chest space. And I said, and what is that like? And he said, bliss. And then I said, and what would you like to have happen next? And he said, what about the ecstasy? And I said, it was quite funny, is bliss not enough? And he said, wow, what a question. Is bliss not enough? He felt a resounding ground of bliss. And at the end of the session, when we gave the session a name for integration and to anchor the experience, he had a name for his experience. And I said, what I witnessed was grounding in bliss, I can journey into ecstasy. But grounding in the bliss first and being able to return to it means that we're supporting flexing the muscle of um, not following full excitation, full abandonment, and actually we've got this grounded layer of bliss that he and others, myself, can return to, and you know in your practice. So I think what you've pointed out about this cooler um, grounding is really important for men, and I see that in my clients. And that was the first time, literally those simple steps. He then could do with that as he pleases, but he had it was the few signature practices that could support somebody into a grounded sense of bliss with their self practice. Yeah.
Mm, that's really great, man. I've been sat with my what to call my level two course, and it really ties into everything you're describing. I love the work of Mantak Chia. It was a great foundational exploration well, kind of that in and linked to all my infinite Tai Chi practices and how they melded, and the Yin Yoga approach of deep embodied feeling. And then I noticed with a lot of the Taoist practices that I'd studied originally, they seem to create too much fire in my body. And
Mm.
instead of taking away some of the things like the compulsion to engage in erotica, they seem to increase it, which is really weird. And then I didn't I didn't find as many solutions as I would have liked to have to how to deal with that as a man. And I think that's why one of the reasons I started to create this way of water approach, it was like I'd seen that blissful hum in the body being created through yoga by being more yin, in my Tai Chi by just kind of following my own energy flow as opposed to having a very rigid structure of posture and all this. There seemed to be
Mm,
this gentleness. And I was like, wow, if I bring this to my sexual energy practices? And so that now I was like, what should I call my level
mm,
two course? And it's still a name in progress, but I think I've got there. And it came about because I was just looking, what is out there? I don't know what's out there, you know? And so I went on Google and was looking around and it was all how to become multi-orgasmic, how to have the best orgasms everywhere as a man, how to retain your semen and it's like,
mm-hmm,
man, it almost feels like if there's a direction that's taking men, mine's going in the opposite direction. And it's
mm-hmm,
like, of course, you can have multiple orgasms. They might happen naturally. You may desire to release less ejaculation or your ejaculation less because you feel calmer and you're not really needing to have the emotional release that comes with ejaculation. So it's just not needed to reach that blissful hum state.
mm,
But then I think I think I'm playing with the idea of something around my level two course being um mastering orgasmic energy, something like that, or living on orgasmic energy. And
mm,
so it takes away this idea of chasing, or there's going to be this multiple orgasm, this up and out, or whatever it is, experience, and brings it more into what you're describing that actually the orgasmic energy itself has a like a middle ground.
mm,
You know, it can be really heated up and create this like, whoa, fire and power in the body. But usually what goes up must come down. And in the yogic tradition, I speak into this in my training that's called the Rajasic spiritual path. And a Rajasic spiritual path is very passionate, very fiery, but it's like a roller coaster. And often say that in the more Rajasic paths, they're big openings and closings. You feel amazing, then you feel terrible and they're very much in the emotional body, the dualistic emotional body of expansion and contraction, fire, water. And I said, then they have what they call the Sattvic spiritual path. Sattvic spiritual path is inner peace, joyfulness, calm, wisdom, compassion. It has all these qualities. And I was thinking, man, this is, I think, what I've been teaching. And I guess, why I hear that you're teaching as well, that just to feel the expansion of that joyful orgasmic energy in
mm,
the body without needing to throw petrol on it, create this bigger up and just dropping into the hum of
mm,
that. And so then at my level two, I start to show men how to relax their body, to allow that to come through their body, because I think there's a psychological component of sexual energy, and the psychological component in men is we have so much shame around it.
mm,
And part of that is the misappropriation, misuse of it in history, you know, that is still being used in the world now as a terrible, terrible ways, very violent ways. And
mm,
also there's the shame and guilt around, you know, seems to have come from a lot of religious, I would say not just Abrahamic, you know, there's even some Buddhists, I think it may be Tibetan Buddhism that say if you aren't using your sexual energy to create a baby, that then everything else is sinful or bad or misappropriation of it. Of course, Tantra says most of your experience of sexual energy isn't making babies. You may not even have a baby in your lifetime, and then what
mm,
is your sexual energy for? So we can see
mm,
it's for joyfulness and compassion to feed the tantric path is, can I allow it to come in and expand in my body instead of just releasing and depleting me? And I think
mm,
that comes from the relationship, as you're saying, of, you know, one of our Taoist masters, he used to say, I don't know if you heard him say this, but I heard him say this once.
mm,
Um, why can't you just enjoy your erection? And I
mm,
often quote that, like he said, you know, he jokes and said, "You're always in a rush to get rid of it. Just enjoy it." And I
mm,
understand what he was saying and pointing to
mm.
in that. You know, it's like, can you just be with the bliss, the hum, the excitement?
Yeah.
And what I tend to do in my training now with the men in this level two course I'm putting together is they use the same massage techniques, embodiment, mindfulness techniques with their tantric, their sexual energy, but then I'm going to take them on now to, okay, most of the Kriya techniques in India and the Kundalini techniques, a lot of them rely on a level of stimulation, the sexual energy really, whether we call it Kundalini or Jing or whatever, but it's a level of stimulation, but that's just to open the furnace. Then it's
Mm,
how do you transmute it into chi,
mm,
which I actually call the quality of the heart, and the Shen, the
mm,
quality of the
mm,
mind. How do you then bring it into those qualities? And for me personally, the that's where relaxation comes in. So there's a
mm,
stimulation to create what you're calling the inner bliss, the harmony. And then how can I just meditate in that harmony? And that for me is like the highest bliss. I
mm,
often sometimes think, it's like a cheat code. It's like,
mm,
because all we were given up to that moment of understanding Tantra and this type of sexual energy was either suppression,
mm,
suppress it, bad, leave it alone. So it creates a shadow self within our spiritual practice. I've got my yoga meditation over here, and my sexual stuff is suppressed and over here. So it comes through in shady ways sometimes. I speak about that in
mm,
my training. Or overindulgence.
mm,
Okay, it's amazing. I'm gonna do
mm.
everything with it, like no holds
Yeah.
barred. And then that doesn't seem to lead to a real stabilized inner peace and a groundedness as a man. So I think
Mm.
there is this middle path that we're exploring here. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, I loved everything you just shared. It resonated. There was so much to respond to, and not that it needs validation, but mirrored experience in my own practice and in teaching. Um, I'll start with in the morning. I invited. So on my retreats, everything's an invitation. Like we don't assume that everyone's going to go along with, so that we can really be in choice. So I invited the men to. So alongside this story, I had a client a long time ago. It was a trans person who was born identified cis male and later um, was trans. And I learned so much from this person who had a penis, and they went to a workshop where they remapped their genitals and gave qualitative names for the parts rather than anatomical names because they didn't identify with that. And they said when they were born, they felt that this was a tool to pleasure women with, like a stick to poke the fire, and they didn't relate to this at all. And for them, it was an antenna, and they called it the penis was their sponge. And I was like, wow. And the Tao talks about, when you enter your partner, if you're, I suppose it could be for wherever, whatever orifice, but in a heteronormative way, you enter the yoni or the vagina, and it's like the key into the mystery of life, into this dark, sacred portal that life can come through, does come through. We all, if we're born naturally, come through this portal, and to listen into the mystery. So to enjoy the erection, the attentive rising of the masculine lingam or penis. So I was inviting the men, like it was a lesson to me to really be in receptivity as a practitioner to witness this person's experience of naming, saying, well, this part of me feels like a sponge. It feels like an antenna to the universe. And it's not something I poke and do with. It's something that I receive through. I receive sensation, information, guidance, support, inspiration. I found that so touching and beautiful and enlivening. I wasn't attracted to this person at all, in any way, and yet to hear their experience was enriching to my experience. I identify differently. I have a different whole sexuality to them, and so that touched me years ago, and it reminded me also of childhood when I don't know what to do with this thing. It just becomes hard. Be out in nature or climb up a tree and feel really connected to trees and this uprising sap, which is talked about in many beautiful cultures and mythology of the rising sap of the masculine. So the simplicity of just becoming receptive, um, you know, through the head of the lingam and all of it. And yeah, so I invited the men to connect with the ground, to squat and feel the perineum and earth energy, and just to become curious about what can we feel and how can I authentically move my body, work with the energy, and enjoy? You and I met actually in Thailand, and you'll probably remember the Kuan Yin Temple, Wat Bang Riang, I think it was called. And I went there with our friend, and we went into the private quarters of this monk, and his lesson to us was breathe in, enjoy, and his eyes were glistening with compassion and joy. He was absolutely like so heart-centered, amazing. And then he said, breathe out, enjoy. This is the simple lesson of life. He said, breathe in, enjoy, breathe out, enjoy. And I really, that was like 2004, 5 or 6 that we were there, weren't we? That's where I met you. And that I thought that combined with this joy in childhood of just feeling alive and feeling that the erection is a yes to life, like without shame, with curiosity, and just standing up for the. So I actually see that if we connect with our sexual essence, sexual energy in that way, it to me it's likened to a prayer of gratitude for being alive, and it's very beautiful. So yeah, I invited and I encourage men and women and to get curious about feeling. It's again that kind of feel and follow statement, which I could say a lot about, but I'll pause. But I really agree on that. And the second point I wanted to make was around. So I've trained as a sexologist and somatic sex educator, and in that body of work, there's something called arousal mapping. And I've noticed two things with this, which resonate with what you've been saying. One is that if we look at those graphs that they draw of male sexual arousal cycle, you can see that the female physiology has a different one, and the men's one goes up very quickly and usually drops again. And you said what goes up must come down. And what I noticed was through doing the practice and sharing it in my practice with others, was that if we see the 9 is the point of no return, tipping over into a genital orgasm or an ejaculatory orgasm, and 10 is that orgasm, then what you were saying, some people suppress things and try not to go there, and others are like doing all kinds of stuff to edge at the end, which would be like an 8, high arousal, high intensity. And again, it's not to shame that, but to give other options, because it's like we're only given these two, either abstain or go crazy, perhaps. So if we map those earlier arousal states, just coming into engorgement for many is not exciting enough. They're used to chasing the intensity, edging, and then some high energy explosive ending, perhaps. But in the process of mapping that journey and giving we could say it becomes sacred when we bring our finest attuned attention to it, when we do it in a loving, self-honoring way, which would say, what would my sensual self like in this moment? Not just what excites my mind to get me to this high state of release. Then what I found happened was that journey transformed. And if you liken it to climbing a mountain, it's like you're going mountaineering. And the peak orgasm would be at 9, would be strap on a hand glider and jump off the mountain. Can feel great. Woo! But we know that the elixir of neurochemicals, hormones plummets because we're releasing into the air or wherever, and in our bloodstream, there's a big chemical crash that happens at that point. So if we're climbing the mountain and if we remap our arousal, what I found myself and what my clients find is that they can get a lot more satiation. So we think at 8 and then explosion is satisfactory, but as you said, you could track those tick boxes. How do I feel during the practice? How do I feel immediately after? How do I feel the day after and the week after? And if we're honest and we say, well, actually, I feel like a bit depleted or less than as full as I was before, then we could adjust our practice without shame, just observing that cycle. And so, what would I need to change for this to be really a generative practice? I call it generative or regenerative rather than depleting and habitual. I also liken it to driving the car manually with gears rather than following this automatic pattern that you described and I've just described. So if we map that differently and we go up the mountain more slowly at the beginning and enjoy the view and the nature there, and I mean by that like the sensations and the quality of peace, groundedness, openness, clear mind, gratitude for this eros energy, this life force energy, just smiling into that, then we can have a very beautiful 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 perhaps. And you talked about the middle ground of just like feeling amazing. So
Mm.
that's a mountain. Imagine that there's a bench just over halfway up the mountain, and you look out and the sun is starting to set. The colors are beautiful, and you sit down to rest at that bench and you feel full up, like there's no more beauty you could possibly, we all have a container. So expanding our ability to hold wonder, awe, excitement, nourishment, fulfillment, peace, whatever the quality or virtue is that we're bathing in. And then this is flexing the muscle of the regenerative benefit over the habit to leave the bench or walk past the bench, go up to the top where the hang glider is waiting for you to jump off. And for me, supporting men in this practice, particularly men, but I'm also seeing more and more women who have they share that they're addicted to porn and sometimes violent porn, that they have shame around. They're like, why am I addicted to this intensifyingly increasing addiction for my arousal and genital release as well? So it's not a binary on genital types, but we're talking about men. So yeah, then men say, wow, I really had to foster some uh, growing of my satiation rather than what I think is going to satisfy me to break the habit of going for the release and scooting past the bench. But so to consciously sit down on that bench to savor becomes a skill and a practice. And over time, what you're left with in your practice. And then I teach men to breathe in from the erection, breathe the blood in, and celebrate the dismantling of the erection, which is the pockets of blood emptying as if they're which they are, absorbing that blood and energy back into the body with a smile. And yeah, in my own practice and with the men that I've worked with, that becomes a celebration of reclaiming and harvesting the fruits of the practice back into the body.
Mhm.
So yeah, your
Mm.
share there inspired me to share that. And there's more I could say, but I'll stop there. It's so beautiful what you shared. Yeah.
I love yeah, it's the retain. Some people say, they use this semen retention word, but
Mm,
actually deeper than that, it's that I guess what you're pointing to as well is that retention of energy. It's retention
mm,
of life force, and that's the essence. That's why the semen retention is on the physical level, but the deeper retention is the retention of energy. But again,
mm,
retention doesn't mean a holding. As you're pointing to, it's just, as the erection starts to vanish, or there's a softness appears, when we can be
mm,
very mindful to that, and if there hasn't been a semen release and that erection softens, often the men, as you're describing, will feel, I describe it like they feel the energy coming into their cells. It's like that.
mm,
And
mm,
I even encourage men to do what I call a conscious ejaculation. So
mm,
it's like the idea is that what I call a conscious ejaculation is just do it the same. So as the heat starts to build, you can feel your body wants to move towards that very naturally. So I say,
mm,
feel it, go through the
mm,
whole ejaculation, build your energy up, have the
mm.
release, but don't rush to clean up, don't rush to do anything, just pause at least
Yes.
5 minutes, ideally 10 minutes. Put your hand
Mm,
maybe on your heart, your belly, whatever feels natural and comfortable. And what they'll
mm,
start to see is they start to produce oxytocin, the bonding
mm,
chemical. And
mm,
they miss that if they rush, right, I'm
mm,
done
mm,
now.
mm,
Oh God, I feel shame, I feel whatever it is. But
mm,
if they can just be still in that release of energy, there's two things they tend to feel. First, the releasing of love chemicals literally in the brain,
mm,
and
mm,
that's designed to bond them to a partner. But when they're with their own body, when they're still, that oxytocin release leads to self-love, and it's like,
mm,
I feel good about myself instead of the shame, the guilt, or whatever. And then the second thing that they'll often start to feel is the ejaculation and the orgasm, which is a separate thing. That's a whole different conversation we got time for today. But the
mm,
ejaculation and the orgasm that happens at the same time is this expansion of energy. And then if
mm,
they rush away from that, they scatter the energy. But if they can just be still 5 or 10 minutes, that
Mm,
energy seems to come back in. It's like called back in into the body in the
mm.
stillness. And
Yes.
actually, usually for the rest of that day, they won't feel tired, they won't feel drained in the way that they would have otherwise. There's always a chemical depletion of some kind. So that's why I think generally men will start to naturally progress towards non-ejaculation more frequently without guilt or shame because they start to feel the energy of it, that and they don't need the
Mm,
emotional and the tension release they used to get from orgasm because, or ejaculation, because that energy is now flowing freely in the body and isn't getting
mm,
stuck. Sometimes call the ejaculation the release valve. So it's so
mm.
much pressure, so much tension in the body has psychological, emotional components to that that can be freed and healed, but eventually the energy is just free to expand. I've really enjoyed this chat with you, man, and it's gone so
Yeah.
quickly again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a call to get to, and I think you have busy things ahead for the day, I imagine. So I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed this chat, mate. Really
Yeah.
good.
It was awesome.
We'll do
Really
it again
appreciate it.
sometime.